Okay, yes. So thank you for the introduction. Welcome everyone to my PhD defense. And before we dive right into the topic, I want to motivate why I think this topic is both interesting and important. And my motivating example are these two pictures. On the left, you see a single ant, right? And arguably, a single ant is a rather simple organism. You can study it, you can try to understand it. Well, arguably, there are more complicated organisms, but you can study it, you can try to understand it, you can try to understand how ants interact, there are pheromones and so on. But just because you know how a single ant works, it wouldn't tell you much about the ant colony, right? There's a big disconnect here. And this is also true for the two models that I'm working with. They're called population protocols and chemical reaction networks. And these formal models have the same property that they are made up of many rather simple entities that interact to form a system that is hard to understand, hard to analyze. So why do I care about these two models? Well, because they have a bunch of interesting and important use cases. For example, chemical reaction networks are used to predict the cause of an epidemic. They're used to design drugs and molecular devices. Similarly, population protocols have use cases in the Internet of Things with ad hoc sensor networks. They can be used to control robot swarms and self-organizing systems, and also have applications in social networks. Right. And because of all these use cases, and because these models are hard to analyze, my topic is about making the analysis of these models practical or efficient. And there are 3 steps to this. I am from the chair of theoretical computer science, so there's a theoretical foundation first to understand these models on a theoretical level. Then we use this to find new and efficient algorithms to analyze these models. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, we make sure that these methods are available in a tool that you can actually use, and so that these methods are actually useful. The results of my thesis can be broadly categorized in 3 topics. There is a first topic about the efficient verification of population protocols. So is this protocol correct? Does it do what it's supposed to do? Then there's a topic about the synthesis of population protocols. How can we create a protocol that does what it's supposed to do? And it's supposed to be an efficient one. And then finally, there is a part about how can we predict what a chemical reaction network does. In this talk, because of time constraints, I will only have time to talk about the first and the third topic. Specifically, in the first topic, I'm going to focus on the tool. So there will be a lot of demos. And in the third topic, I'm going to focus on the idea behind the method. Okay, let's jump right in. And I want to introduce the first model, population protocols, using birds. This is my favorite introduction. This is I have not thought of this way to introduce this model, and also I have not drawn these birds. These are drawn by Michael Blondin, one of my co-authors. But I think they are best to learn what this model does. So these birds are basically our ants from the initial example. These are the agents in our model. We call them agents, and they are mobile, right? They can fly around, they can move around independently. They are also very cool birds. They are anonymous, meaning you can only distinguish 2 birds by their color and shape, but not by their name. Like, there are no identities. That's why they have these shades on. Further, they have some resources, so they can follow simple rules. However, because these rules are simple, these resources are very limited. So there's only a small sensor, no smartphones. Then when these birds fly around, they can come into contact with other birds, and then they interact in pairs, right? You can see this with this squiggly orange line. These 2 birds are interacting now, and that means they can change their state, visualized by this color change. Right. Further, every agent has an opinion. This can be yes or no, true or false. And this opinion depends on their state. And the goal of these agents is to compute a consensus, to come to a stable consensus to answer a question. And this consensus means that they stay, for example, this is a consensus for false, for no, but meaning they can still change their state, but it's a stable consensus as long as they will stay in this consensus forever. Right. So let's jump into an example of a population protocol. Here we have a group of birds, a flock of birds, and they have different colors. They can be blue or red. And the birds need to answer the question, are there initially at least as many blue birds as red birds? For us as an outside observer, this is a rather simple question. We can see there are 3 blue birds, 2 red birds, so the answer is yes. However, the birds need to come to that conclusion on their own by interacting in pairs. And how do they do that? They follow a population protocol. This is a majority protocol where you have 4 states. You can either be blue or red, and large or small. And then there are a bunch of rules that these birds follow when they meet someone else. For example, if these 2 birds meet, then there's a rule that says that they become small because they have different color. And then there might be another random interaction. For example, these 2 birds might meet, and there is no rule for them, so nothing happens. Next, these 2 birds might meet, and there is a rule for them. It says that if a large bird meets a bird of a different color, then the small bird changes their color. Come in. So it becomes small and blue. And then there might be another interaction. We know that one already. They become small because they are both large and have different color. And then finally, these 2 birds might meet. They are both small. But in case of a tie, we want the system to come to a blue consensus. And this is a rule for that. So if they're both small, they don't know. So the small red bird becomes blue as well. And now we came to a consensus. Everyone says, yes, there were at least as many blue birds as red birds. And that is exactly what we wanted. And further, there are no more possible state changes. So this is a stable consensus as well. So that worked. However, the question is, does that always work? So this protocol has to work both with any sequence of interactions, but also for any possible initial configuration. In this example, we had 5 birds. There might be 10, a million birds. We don't know. It has to work all the time. And what I actually want this protocol to do is these 2 properties you see here, the correctness properties on the board. The first property basically says, if there are initially at least as many blue birds as red birds, then eventually we reach a situation where there are no more red birds at all, forever. And similarly, there's a property for the other case. Or in simple words, birds converge to the color of the majority. So how can we know if this actually works? Well, one thing we can do is we can run a bunch of simulations to test it out, right? Or at least try out a little bit what this system does. We saw one execution, but we have a very interesting tool that is also part of my thesis that is designed at our chair. It's called Peregrine, and it has a nice online demo that we can try out together. And we have this protocol already prepared. It's called the majority voting protocol. It's an example. And as you can see, we have 4 states here. There are no birds here, but the colors are the same. And we have capital letters and non-capital letters for large and small. And we have the same transitions or rules you saw in the presentation. They're just written a little bit differently, where you see that if these 2 kind of birds meet, then they become small, right? Same as before. And now what we can do is we can run a simulation of the system. So we can add a bunch of blue birds and a bunch of red birds. Let's try an example where we have more red birds, because we already saw one for blue birds. I don't know if you can see this. Let me move this a little bit. Right. So as you can see, we have more red birds. So we would expect the system to come to a consensus that there are more red birds now. And what we can do now is we can start the simulation and let these birds fly around in space. And when they come into contact, you saw it up here, they change their state. You can make this also a little bit faster. And after a short time, you see there's one large big blue bird left, and now it's gone. There are no more large blue birds. This is important in a second when we try to understand why this protocol is always correct. But as you can see, the number of blue birds keeps decreasing. And if we speed up the simulation a little bit more, then we reach a consensus where everyone is indeed red. All right, so another example where it worked. But in my talk, or in my contribution, it's not just important. How can I come back to the slides? It's not just important that it works. Sometimes we want that this works all the time, right? And to understand how we can verify that this protocol works all the time, we need one more thing before we can go on, and that's the definition of a configuration. So the configuration of a population protocol is a vector that describes the number of birds in each of the possible states, right? So in this example, we have one large bluebird, two small bluebirds, and two red small birds, right? And this vector is all you need to describe the global state of the system. This is fully determined because our agents are all anonymous and identical, right? They have the sunglasses. So if you know this, then you can have an observation, because in a lot of papers, there are proofs that prove that some population protocol is correct. And these proofs are typically have a certain structure, right? And they're typically structured in phases or stages, we call them, where the system becomes more and more restrained, right? More and more configurations become unreachable. And this structure is exactly what we try to capture with the stage graph object. It's a formal object that helps us to prove that a population protocol is correct. Let's understand stage graphs. So a stage graph tries to prove a property. For example, one of the properties you saw before, if there were more bluebirds than redbirds, then eventually there are no more redbirds forever. And a stage graph is, first of all, just a graph, right? We have nodes and edges. It's a directed acyclic graph. And these nodes, we call them stages. They are possibly infinite sets of configurations. So a lot of the configurations your system can be in a single stage. And crucially, this set of configurations of a stage, it is inductive, meaning if your system is in that stage, then you will stay in that stage forever, right? It's an inductive invariant. Further, every initial configuration of your system is covered by some stage. Intuitively, you start covered by the proof, right? Every possible initial state is covered by your proof. Further, if you are in one of the stages, they're currently orange at the bottom, where you have a outgoing arrow, where you have a successor, then these stages have the property that all the executions, or the executions that start in that stage, they will enter one of the successor stages with probability 1, right? Or intuitively, you will always make progress and become more restrained if you can become more restrained according to this proof. And then finally, if there are no more successors, then the post condition holds, right? That's the last property we need. And now if you look at these 4 properties, then it's rather easy to argue that the system actually satisfies this property, because you start in the proof, you make progress, and then you get stuck where the post condition holds. And that's one of the theoretical results we have. Actually, we go a step further. We don't only say if you have a stage graph, then the property holds. We also say if the property holds, then there is such a stage graph. We even go a step further. We say we have stage graphs that can be described in a simple manner, meaning we describe the stage graph with Pressburger arithmetic, and still the property holds that the protocol is correct if and only you have such a simple stage graph. This already gives us a decidability result, so the verification of these kinds of properties is decidable. However, it does not really help us in practice, because these stage graphs can be huge, right? So that's not practical at all. And remember, the topic of my thesis is practical analysis, efficient analysis. So what we do in practice is something slightly different. We use 2 properties of population protocols. Most systems have a small stage graph, so that's great. So we can try to get one of these. And most systems make progress by killing off transitions. What do I mean with that? I mean that some of the transitions, some of the rules become useless at some point. And we can use these 2 properties to find, or basically use heuristics to construct a Pressburger stage graph that proves most of systems in the wild. So let's look at this in action, because we have, as promised, implemented this in Peregrine. Oh, it's still running. Wait, I have to move this. Okay, because we have a verification tab in Peregrine where you can just run this, this algorithm we implemented. And if you just press the verify button, after around 2 seconds, you get a check mark It says, yes, this protocol is correct, but you don't need to trust this. You can actually look at the stage graph or a visualization of this stage graph. This is a Venn diagram visualization of a stage graph, specifically of two stage graphs, one for the property if there's supposed to be a blue consensus, and one for the property if there's supposed to be a red consensus. In this Venn diagram visualization, we have the stages drawn as areas, right? So this is the area of stage S1. And inside of this area, there are a lot of points, and these points correspond to the configurations that are in this stage. So for example, we can look at this example here. This configuration with 3 large bluebirds and 6 large redbirds is in the stage S0, right? It's supposed to become a red consensus. And so it's in the stage that contains all the configurations that are potentially reachable from initial configurations that are supposed to have a red consensus. Don't worry about the potential. It's an over approximation, what we use, but yes. So these are basically the configurations that you can reach initially. And then what you can do is you can run your simulation of the system and visualize how it moves around in this space. And what we do here is let me pause this. This is very fast. We build up a partial Markov chain of the system. For a initial configuration, a population protocol is a DTMC, a discrete time Markov chain. So we can look at the states that we visit when we run this execution, and we can draw the states in the right area of this visualization. And what you see is initially we started in S0, and then we dropped into S4, and we will never leave S4. This is what I mean with progress. One more thing I want to mention, if you look here, we have a certificate. In this case, it's the number of large red birds. Intuitively, the certificate is the reason, or is a reason, why this system will make progress. And if we replay the simulation, you will see that this certificate will eventually become smaller and smaller, and this is why you will drop into this in this next phase. So let's replay this. It's 5 now. Now it's 4, and then we drop into the next phase of the execution. All right. And now we are in the next phase of the execution where we have no more large blue birds. That's the point in the visualization we saw before where there were no more large blue birds. And then if you continue, you will eventually drop. Let's make this a little bit faster. There we go. You will eventually drop into the final phase. And now we have the right consensus, and it is a stable consensus. Right? So basically, a population protocol explains to you why the protocol is correct, how it computes. It also gives you a sense of how far along you are in your execution. And further, it also tells you how fast the computation is in the specific stage you're in. So for example, in this first stage, we saw it was rather fast. It dropped into the next stage rather quickly. And we also can give you a bound on how many interactions you will need to drop in there. And in this phase, we saw it took a little bit longer. We only have a worse bound here, basically telling you how fast your protocol is. So you can maybe find a protocol that is better in that sense. One last thing I want to show you is I want to show you what happens if we run the verification with a protocol that is incorrect. So in this version of the protocol, I removed one of the 4 transitions. And now I can tell you this protocol is incorrect. And the interesting thing, or the cool thing is, if you try to verify this, Peregrine will not only tell you, no, I can't verify this. It will also tell you, it will also try to find a counterexample. In this case, it did find a counterexample. Specifically, it found the initial configuration where there's a tie. And the question was, are there at least as many bluebirds? So we want this to become a blue consensus. But because I removed the rule for the tie, we get stuck in a configuration without a consensus. Right. So let's go back to the slides to conclude this part. Yes. So to conclude, stage graphs help you to can be efficiently constructed. They verify liveness properties. They can be independently checked. They are a proof object. They explain how the protocol works and how fast it is. And they help you to find counterexamples. Yes. So let's go to the second part of the talk about chemical reaction networks. The chemical reaction network model is very similar to the population protocol model. That's why I'm going to focus on the differences. Yeah, so if you look here, we have these species. There are 4 species. These would be the states from before, right? You can be in one of these states, one of these species. We have a bunch of reactions here. You know, they look very similar to the ones you saw in school in chemistry, right? But one thing we notice here, these rules have a different number of molecules on the left and on the right, meaning the number of molecules can change, or in the flock of birds example, the number of birds could grow or shrink. So that's a difference in the chemical reaction network model. Further, we have continuous time. I mentioned before, the population protocol model behaves like a DTMC, like a discrete time Markov chain. The chemical reaction network model behaves like a CTMC, a continuous time Markov chain. This is why we also work with time in seconds, right? Not steps. And we have these numbers above these arrows. And these intuitively tell you how fast this reaction is, right? So this reaction is a lot faster than the one below it, right? And then the last major difference between chemical reaction networks and population protocols is the focus. They have different use cases. Specifically, population protocols are designed to do a specific thing, right? For example, compute majority. Whereas a chemical reaction network is usually used to model a system so we can try to understand it better, right? So in this case, we're modeling a viral infection in a cell, and we want to understand how fast the viruses grow and spread and produce more virus molecules. Yes, so a typical question you have about these models is, how does the system evolve? How many viruses are there in 200 seconds? And so what you actually want to do is a transient analysis. Unfortunately, transient analysis of chemical reaction networks can be quite complicated. We already mentioned that the number of molecules can grow, right? So you have a state explosion problem here. You can have very complicated behavior dynamics of the system. And there are other problems like stiffness, multimodality, and things like very fast reactions and slow reactions, stuff like that. And what you do is to still try to tackle this problem is you do either a direct or an indirect analysis of this, of chemical reaction networks. In the direct one, you try to numerically compute the answer to your question. So you run an algorithm that tries to compute this directly. Unfortunately, that's often not feasible, specifically if the system has a lot of states or has reactions that are very fast and very slow, then these things often don't work. And then you would use the indirect approach, where you run a lot of simulations of the system to understand how the system typically behaves. And this is where my contribution comes in. In my contribution, I try to make this simulation of the system very efficient so that you can do this transient analysis in a practical way. And the main idea of my approach is memorization, meaning I want to reuse old simulations to generate new simulations. Right. So let's first understand why the normal simulation you do of these systems is not good enough. The default simulation algorithm you would use is SSA, stochastic simulation algorithm, and it is one of the first ones we knew, and it samples one reaction at a time. So what you do is you start at t equals 0 in your initial state, and then you just look at all the possible reactions that could happen. You compute how fast they are according to the model, and then you sample when the next reaction happens and which reaction it actually is. And then you go further in time according to the sample you just did and apply the reaction that you sampled, right? And then you continue. You look at the reactions that are possible, choose one and apply, and so on, right? And this is how you would move from configuration of your system to configuration of your system. But that's, of course, very, very slow, right? We have many, many molecules in our system, and we probably need many, like millions of reactions to just do a single simulation. And remember, we need many simulations to judge our system because the system is stochastic. So that's not good enough. And the first idea we have is, if applying a single reaction at a time is not good enough, then what if we apply multiple reactions at a time? I mean, that's the first idea you have. And so what we imagine is, let's say we have pre-computed these segments, these short trajectories, these short simulations of your system for every possible state. If you have these pre-computed, then instead of applying a single reaction at a time, you could just apply a bunch of them, right? So you could choose one of the pre-computed segments and apply it, reaching a new state where you have them pre-computed again, choose one of them, apply. And of course, this is much faster. The problem is, how do you get these pre-computed segments? We already talked about it. There are many states of your system. How can you pre-compute anything for this many states? And the answer is you don't. What you do is what I propose is you do a abstraction-based simulation or segmental simulation of the system. This is the method that I introduced. And the idea is basically, well, don't treat the states independently, try to group them, right? And what we do is we observe that in chemical reaction networks, states that are close or similar behave similarly. Meaning if you have, let's say, 1 million virus molecules or 1,000,001, doesn't really matter, right? And so what you do is you take your state space and split it into regions. We call them abstract states. And these abstract states, they get a representative. It's typically the center. It's a specific state that's supposed to represent the whole region. And for these representatives, we compute our segments. So let's look at segmental simulation in action. So this is our memory, right? So we pre-computed this, and we have 4 regions, 4 abstract states. They have different colors. And for each of them, we have this point in the middle. That's the representative. And starting at that point, we have these short segments. Notice that they end once you leave the abstract state, with the idea being that this is the position where the system might change significantly, right? And in this case, we have pre-computed 3 segments for each of these abstract states. And if you want to do a fast simulation now, you start in your initial state as usually. You check in what region you're in. So currently we are in this orange region here. So we would randomly choose one of the 3 orange segments and apply it to our current state. So that could be the C1 leading to a new state. And this state is now in the blue region. So we would look at the blue memory part and choose one of the segments and apply it. And you would continue like that. Currently we're in green, so we apply one of the green ones. We're still in green, so we continue with green, right? These are random segments. And now we're in red, so we apply one of the red ones. This is basically the idea of segmental simulation. 2 things I want to mention. So one thing is, we have a lot of detail here that we probably don't need. We have all these specific reactions you took that make up your segment. You only need the summary of them. These are the black arrows, so you can forget all of that, right? And then we have still a problem that we need to somehow fill our memory initially, and that's annoying, right? So what we do instead is we start with an empty or maybe partially filled memory, and then you lazily compute the segments. So how would that look like? If you are in a state like currently, we're in the initial state again, we are in a state where we already know a lot about, so we can just reuse as before. But now we are in a part of our memory where we know nothing. So now we compute a new segment and apply it and save it in memory. So if we come back to this region, you can apply it again, right? And so, yeah, this is basically how segmental simulation works. And as you see, it fills the memory on the fly. So let's conclude this part. Segmental simulation reuses old simulations to generate new ones. That's the important part. It is an approximate simulation technique, so it does not completely faithfully simulate the system. However, it accurately captures the dynamics of most systems, so you can use it to speed up your simulation by a significant factor, allowing you to efficiently predict how the chemical reaction network will look like in the future. Yes, so thank you for your attention. That was my talk.